being here. I am the substance use navigator for Howard Hospital, and I will tell you a little bit about what that actually means. I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to work and know all of these panel participants, and just honored that they are willing to come and share with you what they do in their daily lives and in their work. So my role in the hospital, there's a new program that Howard has adopted, and a really incredible emergency department doctor named Juliette Lemires got word of a federal grant that was coming down the pipeline. And California was going to be the recipient of some funding through the Public Health Institute to combat the opioid epidemic. And the focus was going to be in the emergency department. So Juliette Lemires went after this grant, and Adventist was behind her, and they were able to hire me, and I work in the hospital, and I also get to work at the Redwood Clinic. So my role is to meet a patient in the emergency department if they are in withdrawal and or if they're interested in some kind of intervention in their substance use disorder. And the Bridge program is focused on opiates, but I also meet any patient that is struggling with addiction. My role is to meet the patient where they are in that moment and to engage them in whatever form of treatment and or local resources that they're interested in. So that might be a program that Dr. McCullough will talk about that we have at the Redwood Clinic for medication-assisted treatment, or someone might be interested in going into an inpatient, treatment program. The idea is really to break down barriers in the medical system for patients who might otherwise feel like there's stigma around addiction. So we're really trying to be open and compassionate and welcoming to all people that are suffering with addiction. So if you have a friend or a community member or a family member who is interested or wanting to have a conversation about some support, they can call my phone number, and I'm happy to talk with you afterwards. So I'm going to let our panelists speak and introduce themselves when it's their turn, but I just want to take a moment to really recognize and honor Andrew. Andrew is our keynote speaker, and he's going to be sharing his story. But Andrew is also a friend of mine, and I met Andrew. I'm a health coach, and I met Andrew when he was actually deciding to come off of Suboxone, and I didn't even know what that was. Like, that was this is a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. And so I was working with Andrew just around diet and lifestyle, but I got to know him, and he's a really special and exceptional person. And I also got to witness someone who was tapering himself off of Suboxone with really healthy food and supplements, and it was really intense.
Yeah, it was awful.
So I'll let Andrew share his story, but he's just a phenomenal person, and I'm grateful that you're here today to share it with us.
Thank you, Marianne, and thanks everybody for being here. So it wasn't very long ago that not only would I not have been invited to speak at things like this, but I wouldn't have had any interest in it, and I wouldn't have been allowed in anyway. My life today doesn't resemble the way things were 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, or even 5 years ago, really. My name's Andrew Thomas. I'm the youngest of four. I'm a college graduate. I am today like a reliable employee. I like books a lot. I like to write. I like to watch sports. Go Warriors! Tough year. And I'm also an alcoholic and a drug addict. I don't think that I knew what that meant for a long time. I thought that to be one of those, to be an alcoholic or an addict, there was like certain criteria for that. You had to be a certain age. You had to be a certain, there was some things that you had to do. There were certain drugs that you had to do, or certain drug, whatever. And since the outside of my life looked normal, my parents are still married, my family's great. I went to college, I got into a good school. I had girlfriends, I had places to live, I had jobs. I thought that all of those things disqualified me from having a problem. I thought that like I partied, but like so does everybody. So I didn't know what was coming for me. And by the time I did, it was really late. So I was on Suboxone for a long time, and the way that you get on that is you do too many opiates for too long of a period of time. I'm very much a child of I remember when Oxycontin was new. Like almost everyone I know, when I went to high school, I started experimenting with drugs and alcohol, and it was super fun. I started smoking pot, and I remember listening to, I don't know if anyone knows Radiohead, but I got stoned and I listened to this Radiohead album, and I was like, whoa. And I had like a quintessential, pot experience with it. I started drinking, and it was fun, and I could, talk to girls at parties and do silly stuff, and it seemed innocent enough. And then I took some Vicodin, and that was fun. And then I took some Percocet, and that was fun. And then I just kind of incrementally went up the ladder the way that you do. And then Oxycontin came around, and it's much stronger than when I was in high school. It didn't seem like that big of a jump to go from taking a Vicodin and then taking a Percocet to taking an Oxycontin. They look the same. They're made of the same stuff. And I didn't think it was that big of a jump. If I had known it was that big of a jump, I probably would have done it anyway. But anyway, it was a big jump, and that kind of, my experience with that, really drove the next 10 years of my, well, honestly, it probably still drives it. But I was under that for a very long time. So things got really bad, right? I went from Oxycontin, and then that didn't work anymore. So I went to heroin, and you just you keep going. I didn't keep going because I was a bad person, and I didn't keep going because I didn't give a shit about the world. I maybe thought those things, but in retrospect, I don't think that's why I kept going. I think I kept going because I'm just wired a little bit differently than most people, and when I take something that makes me feel good, I want more of it, period. And it doesn't really matter what the cost of that is. And so one thing that I think it would have been helpful to know, again, it might not have changed anything, but it might have kind of hastened the end quicker, is, or a problem for me was that, in order to, I was a person who did drugs a lot, and in order to maintain that as a lifestyle, I did things that I normally wouldn't have done. I lied to people that I really love. I stole from people that I really love. I was totally unreliable, although I was raised to be a hard worker with a good ethic. I was totally flaky. I was scared all the time. I would run. I would yell. I would do all these things that were not part of who I thought I was. And it's easy to draw the conclusion when you're doing those kinds of things that I must be a bad person. Maybe I was just wrong. It's now my understanding that that's not the case, that I was, that while I'm accountable for all the stuff that I did, it was probably more accurate to describe me as a sick person than a bad one. But I didn't know that at the time, and again, not sure that it would have stopped me, but it would have. It was good. It was a relief to find that out when I found that out. So let's get to how I found that out. Things got really bad. They got worse than I thought they could. I always thought that there would be something that would happen to me that would make me snap out of it. That I would get arrested, or that a girl would leave me, or that I would go to the hospital, and that some event would happen that would compel me to be you know what, I've had enough. This is now too much. I'm not going to do that anymore. And the reason I thought that is because that's the way it works for regular people. Like if every time, a regular person drank, they, crashed their car, they would either, they would be like, oh man, this is a problem. I should probably stop drinking. The people I run with, like our conclusion to that is usually to stop driving. We're like, oh, I just won't drive anymore. And that way, so like I drew these conclusions. I kept thinking that something was going to happen, like some outward event would happen just like it did in the rest of my life. And I think that's an important point too, where this is, my relationship with drugs and alcohol is the only thing in my life that works like that. If every time I played, football, I ended up in the hospital, sooner or later I would be like, I probably shouldn't play football anymore. If every time I, walked across the street, I got hit by a car, I would find a different street to walk across, or like I can think in those in cause and effect and consequence in other areas of my life. I just either can't or don't in the way that it relates to drugs and alcohol. So what happened for me is, my story of recovery. So I haven't drank or used illegal drugs in a number of years now. It's amazing to me that I can say that. I never thought that would be possible. And I think one of the reasons I never thought that would be possible is, I just thought I would never be able to, but also I didn't think I would ever want to. I think that there was a lot of times when I tried to kind of straighten things out, like after getting arrested or after going to the hospital, where I was like, I just want things to cool down a little bit. I just need to get my ducks in a row and get a new job and get some money and get a girlfriend. And then after that, once I have like things to live for again, once I have all the stuff that everyone else has that seems to be worth it, then I'll be fine. And it never, it never happened that way. I didn't think that I would ever not want to, and like I don't anymore. And that it's really hard to explain how big of a deal that is to people who don't know it. I mean, I was trying to think in the 4 minutes of preparation I did for this, I was trying to think of a good corollary for a person who doesn't, suffer from addiction or whatever. It would be like if you just hated eating, and you were like, I hate food, it's so stupid that I have to eat. And someone told you, you can actually not eat. That's how unbelievable it is that I don't do the things that I used to do. There was a time when I was like, it's great that you all have these promises, and I believe that other people have gotten through this. There's just no way I'm going to. So how did I do it, right? There's a couple things that I think are important to. I think there's lessons that like other people can learn from what I went through. And like one that I want to make real clear is like one of the ways that I learned is through failure, like a lot of failure. I tried to do this a bunch of times. I first went to rehab in 2010. And at that point I was like, I'm done. Like I've had too much. This is too much. I had so much that I went back in 2015. And it was incremental change, and I had to fail a lot. And that's it's a tough thing to have to do because my drug and alcohol use isn't incremental. So if I haven't used for a year and I start using again, it doesn't take any time to ramp up. So it feels like total failure because it's like, oh, this is just like it was, maybe even worse. So failure was a big part of my experience, and I think it's important, or it was important for me to learn that, like, for me, that's just part of it. I know other people who went to rehab or walked into a 12-step meeting or one day said I'm done and who have never picked up again, and like, hats off to them. That's awesome. It certainly can happen. It just didn't for me. So like my experience since 2010, since going to rehab for the first time, has been, really like coming to terms with the maybe the gravity of my problem, or like the thing, the size of what I was up against, and knowing that for me, like I couldn't afford to. I eventually reached a conclusion, I think, that like I couldn't afford to be particular about like what kinds of help I got and what kind I didn't. So there was a point when I was like, okay, rehab, like I need to do that. 12-step programs, I need to do that. Therapy, I need to do that. Like eating better, need to do that. Suboxone, sure. Like anything, like I eventually over the course of years got ground down to a point, through suffering really and failure, where it was like, okay, like this needs to change, and since this is a big problem, like I need to be prepared to throw everything at it that I can. What was also confusing about that to me is that there are things that that didn't work for me at certain times that did later. So like I first got sent to an AA meeting, for example, when I was in college. I got in a fight with a kid on the football team, and I went to a D1 school, so he was real big, and I was super drunk, and I was like, let's do it. And I got in a fight, stupidly. Anyway, it was, I had a drinking problem, right? Like everyone else who went to that school knew that except for me. So I got sent to an AA meeting, and it was cool. Like I thought there was something, on paper, nothing about it appealed to me. But when I got there, like the people seemed pretty cool, and there was clearly some like success and some hope there, and I thought that was cool, and I went for a week, and then I drank again, and I never went back. And I was like, great, good for you guys. Later in my life, those same meetings, because they're the same everywhere, would prove to be like hugely pivotal, and still are, like hugely important to what I have going on. And the reason I bring that up is because, for you, your kids, or whoever, like just because something doesn't work once doesn't mean it won't later. Suboxone's another good example for that. I started taking Suboxone in like 2008 maybe, and it probably helped keep me alive, I guess, and which is important. And maybe in the same way with AA, like I knew there was something there maybe, and I don't know if it was because I wasn't ready for it, or it just wasn't the time. Like I did it for a while, said it's not for me, and failed, maybe you could say. Didn't work for me then. Eventually, when I got back on it, it was like hugely pivotal in me getting to where I got. And like I can't really explain that in broad strokes terms. I just know that like, I'm not the best person to ask about like when help is going to help for me, or when it's going to be the right kind of help. And just because I tried something once and it didn't work doesn't mean it won't later. And so like I think as a community, or like if I look back, there's a whole personal side to it, right? Which is, I had to get to a point where I was willing to do things that I didn't want to do to get what I wanted. I think regular people call that being an adult. I had to get to a point where I was like, I don't really want to go to therapy. I don't really want to go to meetings. I don't really want to be on Suboxone. I don't really want to do this stuff, but like, I don't want to live the way that I have been living. So I need to be prepared to do some stuff I don't want to do. And so for me, like it was very important to have resources available. Rehab was big for me, even though like it wasn't the last time I used and drank. Like that was big for me. There was things I learned there that I didn't even know I learned until years later, when I was confronted with something and I was like, oh wait, that's what Dave said this is it. This is that moment he was talking about. The same way with Suboxone, like I had to, I think that it's important to, be able to kind of spread the message that like there's a way out, and like there are resources available, which I'm sure other people are going to talk about. So that was important to me. I think I think another thing that, one of the reasons this is so confusing, I think, to a lot of people is that, like for a lot of people, and I think this is an important thing to kind of like keep in the open in general too, where, for a lot of people, like drugs and alcohol are fun, like I know people who drink and use sometimes, and like it enhances the quality of their life. There's probably people in this room who will like go home and have a glass of wine or two and watch Jeopardy, and like it'll be great. I'm like, good for you. I think that, I was in the DARE program where everyone was like, which is essentially a different way of saying just say no. And I think it's important, at least for me, to realize that like that didn't work then, and that's also like not my message. My message to kids is like, don't do what I did, because that's what someone told me when I was young, and I was like, great, this is the whole like do as I say, not as I do. It doesn't work. I'm going to find out on my own. But what I didn't know that I think would have been helpful to know is that even though like when I drink or use, and someone next to me drinks or uses, like, we have totally different experiences with it. Totally different. They look similar, and sometimes it looks like I just, like, drank a little too much the way regular people can go, but, like, I am now convinced that I am, like, flat out wired differently. I think there's science to back that, and I honestly, like, I think that I was like that I don't think I did something to myself to get that way. I think I was like that when I was born. I'm just wired differently. And so it was tough to see people drinking and using drugs with impunity, having fun with it the way that I used to, and then being like the only kid who couldn't. So that's a tough hurdle to get across for like really good reasons. You don't want to miss out. You don't want to, like, not have this thing that everyone else has. But like I said at the beginning, in retrospect, like, one of the reasons that 12-step meetings, for example, have been so helpful to me, because those are people who like understand where I'm coming from in a way that other people don't. Where, like, I knew after being exposed to it that, like, there was a place I could go where I didn't have to explain all these things to people. They just got it. It's hard to understand without ever having been there, and it's hard, and, like, to be honest, also it's hard to accept help. At the beginning, at least, I'm like way past that now, but at the beginning it was really hard to accept help from someone who hadn't been there, because I did the, like, I was 25, but I still did the teenage thing where I'm like, you don't know what you're talking about. Like, you have to have been there and been through what I've been through to understand this. And, luckily there is, there's a lot of that available. It's getting younger, it's not that bad. So like, one of the things, I guess, that I try to do today is just, like, be, I guess in this sense, a public example of, like, it was really bad and it's not anymore. In some ways it's as simple as that, is that, like, it was really, really bad. It was really, really hard. And I failed a lot. But, like, because I had more than one chance, because I had tons of resources, because I had medical help, because I had psychological help, because I had a support group of people who were like me, because I had the opportunity to fail and come back, like, because of all those things, I was able to get out from under something that had, like, totally ruled my life for 15 years in a row, and now it doesn't. And like, it's hard to overstate, like, how big of a deal that is for me and how important that was. Anyway, I'm glad that everyone's here. I'm glad that the conversation is getting more open, because I think that's important. I'm glad the conversation is getting more honest, because that's important. And I'm glad to be some small part of, like, getting the message out that, like, this is a problem. We can look at it or not look at it, but, like, it's a problem, and it's going to remain one probably no matter what we do. But that doesn't mean we can't help, right? There does not have to be 100% success for us to help. Like, we just have to make it a little better, and then a little better, and a little better. So anyway, glad to be a small part of that, and thanks for coming.
Hello. I'm Andrea McCullough. I work at Adventist Health Howard Memorial, and I have an interest in substance use and alcohol use. I am happy to talk later about specific medical treatments that we have or other doctors have, or any other questions you might have. But when I was thinking about teenagers and substance use, I kind of was thinking of, where is it that it starts? Or what are some of the contributing factors or some of the paths that people walk down that lead them there? And how does that knowledge help us possibly for other people to try to keep other people from walking that path? In terms of risk factors, there's some risk factors that you can work on, right? And there's some risk factors that are fixed. Andrew was talking about, is there a genetic predisposition? Well, there isn't a whole lot you can do for that other than a gene transplant. So some things we probably can't fix very well, but there might be other things that we can get in on the ground floor and work on ahead of time. In terms of risk factors, knowing that a kid without any risk factors at all can get turned on to drugs or alcohol and end up with a substance use problem is really important to know, right? But the first category that I think about in terms of especially for, before I get to teenagers, I think in general, all of us, not just teenagers or preteens, but all of us have a hole, you know? You could call it a spiritual hole, or, you know, the serotonin and the dopamine craving that your brain has, or you can call it whatever you want, but we all have this hole that we want to fill with something. And so I think that's a really big part for any of us that leads to substance use. In teenagers specifically, you know, you think about boredom, you think about thrill-seeking, you think about low self-esteem, and those are things that are common to almost anybody of a certain age. And drugs and alcohol are a super, super, super great way to fill that need. So, you know, what do you do with that information? I mean, it sounds dorky, but I do think that, you know, getting to kids at an early age and finding something else that floats their boat, something else that keeps them, you know, excited to get up in the morning is a really great way to start. Be that sports, be that 4-H, be that, you know, we want to do really well in school, whatever that is. I think it's, you know, it can be helpful for obvious reasons, like it organizes your schedule. It exposes you to kids that are less likely to use. It raises your self-esteem. Now, saying that, you know, I want you to remember that in some ways, sports can be a gateway drug, because the second big path to, especially for pain pill abuse, is getting a legitimate pain prescription from a doctor. And that happens to grown-ups and that happens to kids alike. We all know people, or I know people, who, you know, fell off a horse, had a femur injury playing football, you know, had a totally legitimate reason to get a pain pill prescription, and then you kind of run out of the pills, especially, you know, in the last decade. Doctors have been really bad about this. You run out of the prescription, you still have a little bit of pain. We, in this community, have zero tolerance for pain. You know, there's no legitimate excuse to ever have to suffer any kind of pain. So you get a refill, and then, you know, when that runs out, you still have the pain, and next thing you know, it's a pain pill problem and not a pain problem. So what do we do about that? Well, you know, of course, doctors are more conscious of this now. We are trying to limit how much pain pills we give somebody even for a surgery. You know, doctors will give you 20 pills, and after that, you're going to tough it out. I do think that the toughing it out part of it is a big sea change that we have to do in this country in terms of, you know, understanding that a certain amount of pain is acceptable in life. And I think that using alternatives for pain, of course, like ibuprofen and blah, 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 you know, cognitive changes, blah, blah, blah. Another problem for teenagers specifically is it's very, very easy to access pain pills and alcohol. 60% of teenagers who use pain pill prescriptions get them for free from their friends or family. So that's, you know, like falling off a log. That's very hard to confront. That's very hard to block. Some of the time, it's intentional. I have a number of patients in recovery who were first introduced to pain pills by their dad. I hate to call out dads, but in this case, it was always dads. And, you know, what do you do with that? You know, a parental figure, somebody that you respect, kind of exposing you to this, it's very, very hard to say no. I mean, that's hard to answer. I do think that if, as a parent, for example, you know that your significant other has a substance use issue, talking to your kid from a young age, like if dad ever does offer you pain pills, I want you to say, I love you, Dad, I respect you, but the answer is no, and if you continue to ask me, I'm going to call Mom, or whatever, you know, I think, but presenting it honestly from a young age, I think, is probably not going to hurt and could possibly help. I was just talking to one of my patients today, whose dad turned around to drugs, and I said, you know, what would you say? Could anything have come in between you and your dad in terms of starting pills? And she said, well, my aunt tried. You know, she had custody of me. She tried to keep me, and my grandmother wanted me to go with my dad because my dad was my biological, and she, you know, preferred the sons in her family, and she wanted him to have custody of me, and so she went with him, and she had been on the swim team. She was a cheerleader. She wanted to go to the Olympics, you know, and she's in a very, very, very different place right now. I mean, it's hindsight's 20/20, but those are just things to think about. Some of the time when you get onto drugs or alcohol especially drugs from friends or family that are on them, it's an accident. So there was a study that suggested that you're twice as likely to end up in the emergency room with an overdose if anyone in your house has a pain pill prescription. I know I, as a doctor, am not good enough about reminding people that if you're on pain meds, you have to lock them up if there's any possibility that somebody can get into them. So for that, Buffy and I brought lock bags that are out here free for anybody to take. I would especially recommend them for pain pills and sleeping pills like Valium or Xanax or anything like that. And we can show you how to use them afterwards. And then the final path that I wanted to talk about is neglect. We're very, very busy in this culture, and we don't, some of our parents are working 2 or 3 jobs at a time. You're not home very much. That's another, big risk factor for drug and alcohol abuse. So I do think that, again, it's dorky, but having family time, set aside, every Sunday night we're going to have dinner together as a family. I feel like we're really getting away from that as a culture, and I think that it can be very, very helpful for teenagers to at least have some voice of reason kind of always in the background. There's a study that suggested that kids whose parents talk to them regularly about drugs and alcohol are 50% less likely to end up using drugs and alcohol. So, it's not going to work all the time, but it's definitely something worth trying. Final, other risk factors, family history of drug or alcohol use, mental health problems in kids, history of sexual abuse or other abuse, and problems with impulse control or aggression as a kid. And so, identifying potential kids with these problems at a young age and trying to get them on the right path and have them in counseling or have them, on sports teams or whatever, I think are all things for us to think about to try to decrease the epidemic.
I'm Buffy Wright Barassa. I'm a program specialist too for Mendocino County, HHSA, Public Health, Community Wellness. I work in the prevention unit and prevention from right? So I'm actually working under some grants for the opioid epidemic. We received grant funding from the state and DHCS for our coalition, SafeRx Mendocino. Some of you have heard of us, some of you work with me. And that meeting happens every month. Yes, I'm putting in a plug. Why? Because we are a community of our members in this county, and we need people from schools and law enforcement and the pharmacies, especially the pharmacies. I'd like to say that as well. So if you know anyone from pharmacies, let them know, we need to talk. And there's a reason, right? And the reasons that we need to talk is because we're trying to attack this opioid epidemic in our county in all kinds of aspects. We're trying to manage and treat and, and save people's lives and prevent it from happening. And so that's a huge job, and I can't do it by myself, and neither could any of us up here. So we need community support in this. And so in my piece, I also work under another grant. It's called Partnership for Success, and that grant, it targets youth in our county from 12 to 25. And so for the first couple years, I was showing up in outlying schools, and we contracted with Mendocino Community Youth Project, who also does this work, and Aurelie can talk about it more on her end, because she's given us some great data as well. I show up to assemblies out in Potter Valley, out in Point Arena, up in Covelo, and I've used the Operation Prevention, the DEA's website, and done some teaching at New Beginnings as well. Those kids are fun. They're like water. You can't hold their attention for long. But the difference in what I do is I don't just come out and I don't just talk about the drugs. I talk about what are you doing? How are you making choices? Because I think you have to back it up, right? And when you do that and you start talking about, okay, so what are you doing after school? Oh, I'm going to go home and smoke some pot. Cool. Do you think you can wait 15 minutes? It's not, hey, don't do that. And I know that would be my first response. I have children. Trust me, I have plenty of times. I can't believe that. No way, don't do that. But the truth is I just want them to wait so that they start thinking, so that they can start making better choices. And this last year, I was fortunate enough to join Rotary. And Rotary our Willits Rotary is it's just a beautiful thing, and I'm very new to it. And then I got roped into and voluntold that, hey, maybe we can do Interact. And so Willits High School opened up the doors to me and allowed me to come in there, and we started Interact, and we officially have a club, and I'm very excited. And so the Interact Club will be working to come up with 2 projects, and hopefully we get some youth soon to be of service at our Crab Fest. The other club that is happening at Willits High School is the Native American Club. I'm very passionate about it. So back in September, we had a take-back event at the Willits High School outside during a football game. And my thing and Aurelie's thing was, hey, how do we support them? Because there's already protective factors in the school. So we talked about risk factors, but there's also protective factors, and they're already here. It's a matter of how are we supporting those things that are happening. I'm a working mom, and so when I get home, the kids have already been there for a while, but what happened while I wasn't there, right? So there's people in place, because I have a big family, who's checking out, and I've got people checking in with me, so that, and then we have conversations, and I take that time, regardless of how late I was out the night before, or that night, working, or doing my other job, right, because I'm on tribal council here for Sherwood Valley. I always make that time to have the conversation. So what's going on? And I've got a lot of kids, so this could take a while. So it's important. But back to Willits High School, I'm really impressed with them because they really do support the clubs that are there in the school. They have an amazing athletic program as well. And then I met the Peace Club, and there's some other clubs. I was just impressed. There was 2 clubs. There was a Christian club and a non-secular, I believe. I don't know as much, but they shared a table together. I was like, wow. Why can't we do that, right? So, it's a good thing. Our community really does have the protective factors in place. It's a matter of us stepping up and, supporting these things and taking our time out of our busy days to continue working with one another. I find it really important also to be honest and open with the youth that I work with, and have found myself getting information that I wouldn't have normally gotten. So, I know that there's pills on the streets of Mendocino County all over the place. These kids are taking their Xanax. They're not really Xanax. They have fentanyl in them. And I also, unfortunately, know that we're losing people as well. And that's the somber part. And it's hard for me because I also have lost people because of the opioid epidemic. My brother and my youngest son's father passed away from an overdose. And then the other one was complications with that drug and other drugs. And that's usually what's happening also, is it's not just one drug, it's several. And it's unfortunate. And unfortunately, when I started 3 years ago, we didn't have any youth who had passed away from an overdose. And in the following year, we had 2 youth. And in this last year, we've had several youths, from Covelo over onto the South Coast. And here in Willits, we've had some people. And when I say youth, I mean 25 and under. And that breaks my heart. So I'm thinking, so what do we do? And how do we have these conversations with one another? I need to have the connection with law enforcement. I have a really good connection with the Sheriff's Department, and I'm grateful for that. We've worked really hard together. They've got their policies and procedures in place to carry Narcan, and then we applied for Narcan. It was a free distribution program, and we supplied them with Narcan. At this point, we're kind of in a standstill. We got so much free Narcan. What are we going to do now? How do we get more Narcan? How do we get Narcan in places where you wouldn't think of having Narcan? You have an EpiPen at the school. Do you have Narcan? And do you have, policy in place for that? And I know that's holy cow, really? Are we talking that serious? Yes. In Fort Bragg, I talked to City Council member Bernie over there. He said they know there's someone with a pill press, but they can't find him. And that are, and our youth, that's our youth. So let's save them, right? Let's save them so that they have a chance to do something, in the future and be great. Right? We don't know what someone's future is going to be. And, and the more that we start talking about this, then it lowers that stigma. Oh, that's just a junkie. Oh, yeah, of course that kid has problems. They come from the reservation, or their parents were alcoholics. They were addicts too. They come out of the system. We need to stop thinking in those terms and start thinking about, these are our people of our community. And how do we lift them up, and how do we support them in their journey? And I'm obviously very passionate about these types of things. So the other thing that I want to touch on, so I'm trying to get these bags out, and I'm trying to get out Narcan, and we're doing presentations, health fairs, however you need us to work, we're trying to be there for our community. We are having a Narcan training at Consolidated Tribal Health. I brought flyers and put them on the table over there. CRIB, which is California Indian Rural Health Board, will be there doing the training, and they promised me more Narcan. So, and the other thing that I'm passionate about, and I do, is I make the connections between the tribes. So you have a tribe here. I know that our connections with the rest of the community are minimal, very minimal. I know with the rest of the tribes it's the same thing. And so part of my work is building that bridge between the county and McCavan, MCYP, whoever, the hospitals, however we need to do that, the school, so that we can start working together, because this is a we program, right? McCavan is Mendocino County AIDS and Viral Hepatitis Network, which actually dropped the hepatitis piece, and their flyer is actually over there as well. They are doing the needle exchange. They're going around and picking up needles all over the place. I know that they pick them up off of our reservation here in Willits off our playground. Isn't that awesome? And they also do other services like testing for hepatitis. Anyways, I really appreciate you all coming and listening. This is near and dear to my heart, and obviously to yours. Thank you.
So my name's Aurelie. I work for the Mendocino County Youth Project. I passed my 10-year mark there this December, which is significant. I've gotten to really witness this community evolve, and I feel like there's more and more coalescing. There's more and more people who are, as Andrea said, wanting to have honest conversation, wanting to come together and recognize that, unfortunately, crisis brings us to a place where maybe we're a little more willing to look at what really is hard to look at, hard to address. And I think in a lot of ways my job is a prevention early intervention specialist in this community, working with 12 to 18-year-olds in all the junior highs and high schools here. I'm now program manager for here and for North County in general. And what I see is that young people are often underestimated for what they truly understand as far as what stress is going on, the bigger challenges in the world at large. I did, and I'm not trying to get political on you guys, I'm going to just say this as a fact, that I had more suicide assessments right after our most recent president was elected, specifically because of the stress that was going on a political level. So I think that one of the main differences between the younger generations and the generation that I'm seeing in front of me is that when we were younger, we did not have exposure and as easy access to the stresses of the world. And kids are really, really tracking that stuff way, way more than we even realize. And honestly, they're kind of the raw form of it. So we want to look at teenagers and be like, what are you doing wrong? And I'm like, no, they're the raw expression of the symptoms of our culture. So if they're showing up with drug addiction and not being able to deal with their feelings, cope with stress, manage life, time management, that's because we're, as a community, lacking in that way. And that's not to point the finger at anybody and to take blame. I think there's a lot of the messages I've heard up here are about let's not shame ourselves, but let's take accountability. So how can we do that? How can we take responsibility for a culture which has not shown us how to grieve, has not shown us how to stress manage, has not shown us really genuine skills? And so the most important thing that I've learned through my journey around working with young people is that, as you had so beautifully spoken, want to have some place to belong, want to have something that they're good at. And those are actually the building blocks for self-esteem. Yeah. Being good at something, being involved somewhere, being accountable, being shown how to be resilient is how important it is to model and genuinely bounce back and show young people that, hey, just because you make mistakes, just because you falter over and over and over again, I still am going to be able to have the moment where I look at you beyond your behaviors. So my mom failed in a lot of ways to show up for me and was an extreme addict and is barely hanging on for her very last probably little while right now. But I think the most beautiful thing she did for me, despite all of her insanity, was show up with shameless accountability. She, in the moments where I was making the biggest mistakes and I was getting subpoenaed to court and I was getting arrested, she showed up and was like, what are you thinking? Like, what other options could you have? And, like, let's look at this thing and talk about it, And so for me, the thing about nagging and yelling and criticizing, and that doesn't work. Like, do any of you, when you are actually making change in your life, like, does it work when your husband's like, you need to whatever, fill in the blank, right? It's like, no, like, right? Like, no, right? So, like, I think, like, if we can, I think one of the reasons why kids feel so safe for me and why I've become a person that many administrators and teachers call in this community to talk to the more difficult young people in our community, more difficult, the kids who are having a hard time expressing themselves, is because I show up and I look at, like, I respect you as much as I respect, it doesn't matter how old you are or where you come from, or I'm just like, hey, you're your own expert. You know your own life better, and I'm not going to come here. Even as a counselor, it's a lot easier for me. As a parent, I just imagine, like, I imagine there's just moments where you're like, yeah, I can't do it. But like, but as a counselor, I love this role. It's great. You go home afterwards, and then I don't have to suffer the consequences of your choices. So I recognize that. But still, in this way, as much as one can do that in a parent capacity or in a community member capacity, is how can I have open, honest dialogue with you about what that is? Another piece that I really want to pitch is that there are awesome 10-minute videos on YouTube that tell you all about the development of the teen brain and how it isn't until 25. I know they look like adults, but they're really kind of like little people in big bodies. And so if we can remember that, I think actually some of the biggest boys that I know that look like men, all of a sudden you're like, yeah, he's still 15 years old. Like, he might look like a man, but like, there's a 15-year-old brain, maybe a 12-year-old in trauma, maybe he's 8 years old, like it, right? It's like the layers and layers. So I think as parents and community members, their prefrontal cortex is not developed. So we have to act in a loving way as that prefrontal cortex as much as possible, and then provide opportunities for them to make mistakes, figure it out on themselves, and support them in how to think, rather than punishing and making them afraid of doing things. Is help me think it out, Mom, so that when I get out there on my own, that I know how to think through my problems. I know how to come up with solutions. I have strategies. And your brain is really vulnerable and under special susceptibility when you're under 25. And so it's really important to be introducing, one, you're extra vulnerable to addiction, but you're also extra available for skill development and all these kinds of things. So I've heard it time and time again. I know for myself, I didn't quit drugs. I chose something else. So for me, that were the most important things in my own sobriety, and what I've witnessed with other people is that if I want a dopamine rush, now I don't need to do these drug addictive behaviors. I can go into nature, I can ride on my bike, I can, and figuring out how do I create that. So yes, it's important to do the counseling and the therapy and all those things, but if I just stay there and I just stay in this treatment thing, then I'm never going to come up with new ways of identifying myself. Because when somebody told me just quit smoking weed when I was a kid, I'm like, that means I'm quitting weed, I'm quitting my money income because I was selling, I'm quitting all of my social circle. It's like, we have to understand what we're asking when we say those things. And for me, having the positive attitude of resilience and figuring out how can I keep a positive attitude is probably the most important thing that I've figured out in my life, is that I have to take diligent self-care. And I see some people in the audience tonight who your job is to take care of people. And so how do we find that balance? If we're going to be the ones who caretake, then how do I really unapologetically take care of myself as well? I think we're all too good at when the people who care and show up and want to give energy, but maybe aren't as good as doing that for yourself. So my encouragement is take loving and fearless care of yourselves. I have a poetic version of resilience on the table over there, and I have a kind of ways to support resilience in youth. That's more of like, these are the sound bites that I've kind of just said about my insights of my work with young people. Both of those are on that table. There's a lot of brochures and information about our local therapy and services. We're providing prevention groups and classroom presentations. And we run a free clothes closet. I have a brochure over there where people can receive free clothes. I'm kind of known in my program and by many of my colleagues as the resource queen of our county. So I get phone calls from everywhere about what's available, and I am really one phone call or email away from pretty much any service that's available in this community. I think of myself as an aunt of, in fact, I'm all of your mothers as well. I'm your aunties, even if you're older or younger, it doesn't matter. So I'm available. I have business cards there. I'm happy to answer any questions. If not in this community forum, at any point, you're welcome to reach out, and I'm very available to direct you in the right way if I don't have the answer. So thank you for your guys' time and your interest in showing up to listen to a challenging topic.
Is this the question part?
I was seeing how long we were just going to sit here for.
Right? We're going to meditate now.
Sir.
All of us are challenged by what we are being exposed to in terms of the environment and political climate in this country and in the world. Young people are also engaging with that. Some of us older folks are actually in denial that young people are actually aware of anything, especially politically. And I know that's not true. I know that they're very aware, very engaged. So the two factors that I'm looking at are the whole idea of just kind of innocent engagement with our talents as young people, and the darkness of what may be seen as impending doom. I just put it out there just like that. How does, and that drugs and alcohol are clearly escape mechanisms from the emotional, the self-medication. How does that get dealt with?
So with prevention, that's upstream. That's not intervention. That's not when a person's already using. That's intervention. We're talking about young people, little people. So what we want to instill is resilience, how to make choices, leadership, those types of things, so that they're able to make those choices, and also gear them with the information. Like, this is what's out there. This is what happens to your brain. That's pretty much what we're looking at as far as prevention. When you're further down, McCavan will argue that prevention is preventing someone from overdosing. So we give out Narcan. At this point, we are in a quandary. We're not sure how Narcan gets into the hands of youth. I know as a county employee, it's going to have to go through the channels. But as a bystander, the Good Samaritan law covers people for that. So I could give Narcan to anyone outside of the county, and what they do with it, that's their, prerogative at that point.
I would like to say something about the sense of impending doom.
Yeah.
And it kind of reminds me of what Khalil Gibran said about, the deeper you scoop your cup, then the more room it has to hold joy. And I feel that sometimes when we confront a lot of the stuff head on, like death and, my life has no meaning, and, all these deep, difficult questions, we're all going to burn up when the meteor hits us. I think that, confronting that stuff head on, I feel like is, I would like to ask you, Andrew, I feel like in my personal life, when I've gone through something really, really horrible, I come out on the other side with this huge capacity for joy.
Yeah.
And I feel like, that's what we can do for the kids, is you got to experience that loss, you got to experience that horribleness, and after you come out on the other side, we're all trying to avoid that. We're trying to avoid that pain.
Yeah. I think that for me, if I'm waiting for the world to change in such a way as to make me comfortable, I better get comfortable now. You know what I mean? I don't think that I think that I really liked what you said about this like zero tolerance towards pain or discomfort, right? Like we are not equipped to. There's something for everything. I got a little knee ache, or maybe I have restless leg syndrome. That's probably what it is. There's all these solutions, right, for everything. I think that it's easy to say that like because of the politics today, or because of the fentanyl today, or because of any number of things, that like this moment is like way different and darker, and like that's the thing to blame. And like that may be true. My suspicion is that it's not, but that may be true. And like that being true doesn't change it can't change my approach to it at all. Right? No one's gonna fix my problems for me. I mean, whether they're around drugs or alcohol or not, really. And I do think that it's never helpful to tell this to someone in the moment, because people tried telling it to me and I was like, get out of here. But the hardest things that I ever went through, like I don't know why I pointed. I was like, I got arrested once and I pointed. It wasn't you.
He doesn't get the
credit. Old habits, right? I got arrested once, and I remember I woke up in jail, and it was like I was so embarrassed and scared and all these different things, and it wasn't until like maybe, and for good reason, like it's an embarrassing thing, it's awful, it's talk about dark, it's not a fun place to be. And like maybe a year or two after that, it was easy to conclusively look back on that and be like, that was the best thing that ever happened to me. That was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it was enough to be like, hey, wake up. So on like a global scale, it's like, I don't know, maybe things have to get worse before they get better. Maybe it's always been like this. I don't know, but I know for me, like it doesn't matter, because it can't. Like I just have to do, the things that I have to do to keep me happy, and hope the rest of the world comes along, I guess.
I feel like, in relation to the gloom and doom, or, the socio-political, like, that things are just getting worse and worse, and the kids are it's right, the kids are much more tuned into everything that's going on via social media and all that. I think it's important to empower youth to feel like they can change the world around them, so that they feel like they have a future, or that they could make changes, at least in their own community, maybe, to change the world around them, so it's not all doom and gloom. It might be shitty out there, but here at home, we're working on some projects that make us feel good about ourselves and our community, and maybe as they grow up, it fosters that sense of, I can change the world. And like with this program we do in Laytonville, Project Alert, I'm sure you've seen it in other schools around the county. We try to teach them skills such as like media literacy, questioning what corporations are trying to cram down your throats, and things like that. I don't know. I think empowering youth is really important. Empowering them to feel like they can change the world, so that they don't feel like they need to escape it.
Yeah, I think Rollo is making a good point, which is it's in the little things. You don't just like, if you're in a completely hopeless place, then you can't handle the like fluorescent blasting light anyways. It's like you start in a little piece. It's like, I expose you. What's one place that you feel a little bit better than right now? And let's talk about that. Let's try and give you more opportunities and strategies on how you're going to increase those experiences in your life. And that's, I guess, the last piece that I didn't share is that I encourage anybody. You all have individual talents, and we need, that's what I heard Buffy saying, we need people who are willing to just show up and do whatever you love to do. Like, you love soccer, then there's soccer teams and that need coaching, and you know what I mean? There's lots of ways. If you ever have some special talent, you want some way to like show up with the kids, like, please take one of my cards, and I promise you I will come up with some creative way for you to sit with some young people, and even if it's a one-time deal, I'm not asking you to commit to, let's commit to the next 5 years. Like, I give you an opportunity to show up for 1 hour and sit in front of some kids and share your story. That's one of the things that I have on here, is the power of sharing story and giving kids that opportunity as well.
I grew up in a family with a lot of problems, and both my parents were alcoholics, and I ended up making some poor choices on my own. And what I came to realize is that I got my life to where it was, which was not in a good space, by making one poor small choice after one poor small choice after one poor small choice. And when I realized that the way out was by making one small better decision after one small better decision after one small better decision, and that was how I could get my way out, and I did that. It wasn't like all of a sudden I realized that, oh, my life is in this bad space, and I had to make some big grand change to change it. All I had to do was make some better small choice in that moment, on that day. And I ended up working myself into a much better situation in my life. And I also want to say that that I've heard it said recently, and I really like this, is that kids that are acting out are not looking for attention, they're looking for connection. And that's what I hear from all of you, is people in the community that the youth can connect to, and I really appreciate that. And I also want to ask the doctor, I had shoulder surgery about 7 weeks ago, and I was given hydrocodone. Along with the prescription for the hydrocodone, I was given some powder that I put in the hydrocodone when I was finished, when I didn't need it anymore. It is, I put the hydrocodone in the pill bottle with whatever was left, with some water, and I shook it up, and it made it useless.
Yeah, and Buffy might know more about that than
And I was
me.
wondering how common that was.
We don't use it at our clinic.
And we have, it's called doTERRA. We have something like that, and you just stick the pills in the bag, add water, shake it up, throw it in the garbage. It's totally biodegradable. It's pretty awesome.
Cool.
I've also heard just putting dish soap in and doing that.
No, we would prefer you to not empty anything into our disposal systems like that, because it ends up in, right, but it ends up in our water system eventually. So we would prefer you to use the doTERRA packets, or drop off your medications at the hospital, at the pharmacy. There's a drop box.
Yeah.
Is there any other
And there's
drop
one at
box?
the police station as
Right,
well, right?
and at the police station. That's why I was looking at him. Not because it was your fault.
The guy who arrested me, you mean?
But if you're not comfortable going to either place, I have business cards over here as well. We have a drop box at Public Health. You can go to SafeRx website and see all the locations that we have for drop boxes around the county. We placed, I believe, 9 other drop boxes around the county besides what's at our Willits Police Station, Ukiah Police Station, and then the Sheriff's Station, and Fort Bragg. Fort Bragg is our leader in collecting medication.
And that's an
I feel
excellent
with
point.
This powder, it's easy to stick whatever you have left in your medicine cabinet and say, oh, I'll
Yep.
take that
That's right.
next week
Yeah,
to the
tomorrow.
pharmacy,
That's
or I'll
right.
take- I'll
Right.
grab it. You know, and then it sits there in your medicine cabinet for a couple of months, and then a couple more months. But the thing with this powder, it was great, when I realized that I didn't need it anymore, I put the powder in and I shook it up with the water and destroyed the.
That's an excellent point. Yeah.
It was really helpful. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's a great point too about incremental change. Like, you know, we hear like with the opioid epidemic in particular, it sounds well, it is. It's really scary and it's really dark, and it's hard to understand how someone, like at risk or not, with family support or not, it's hard to understand how you could end up doing these awful things. It's so scary. Like, how could you snort things in your nose? How could you use needles? How could you how could you possibly do it? And the answer is like one little tiny thing at a time. Like, people don't take a sip of Bud Light and be like, ooh, you know what I'm gonna do? Go shoot some heroin. Like, that's usually not, that's not how it happens. It happens by degrees really slowly, and it makes its own kind of sense, you know? Things stop working, you go to the next and the next and the next, and then pretty soon you're, whatever. And I think it's a great point too, that we live in like a very much, well, I know for me, like it's often I see things in like either or, a very black and white, like, is it this or is it that? Is it success or is it failure? and I think it's a good point to be like, it can be like a really slow way out also, right? Same way it was in. There are for sure people who have different experiences. There can be white light moments. There can be like, I've simply had enough. I know people who were real bad and who just like one day put it down. But you know, for me it was, yeah, exactly what you said. I made a lot of really little bad decisions, one after the other, and then I made like slightly less bad decisions to get out. So
I just wanted to speak a little bit to like a shift in philosophy. I'm an administrator at Willits High School, and I'm on my 3rd year there. And the first year we had a student who got busted for having weed at school, and I remember feeling so frustrated because you're sending them home to an environment where if you suspend them, then they have no parent home, and they have trauma at home, they have access to drugs, and not seeing that as a solution, and having conversations with, I work with Aurelie very closely at the high school, and talking about how frustrated I was. It's pointless to do that. And then we created a group of students, actually 2 groups with boys and girls who, it's an alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs class, kind of like, we called it Healthy Choices class for the kids. And the girl that I'm talking about is now a junior. She was an athlete at the time. She got suspended from the sports team. Now she's like wanting leadership opportunities like Aurelie was talking about. And it's more about like, what can you provide for these kids to make those better choices instead of penalizing them or punitive or discipline. And like my role at the school, I can't be that counselor for them because they see me in a different light. I have a different role. But having someone from the community who comes in and speaks to them and offers them this counseling is making a huge difference at the school. And so I'm not quite sure how to partner with the hospital on what we have going at the school, but having more opportunities like that. Like right now we have a group of freshman girls that Aurelie is working with who have a lot of trauma, who have drug abuse, making really poor choices, but the conversations that she's able to have with them and to have them, you know, be vulnerable and be able to say what's going on, I feel like we can save those kids, you know, and the philosophy that not, okay, well, this kid's just gonna fall through the cracks. And so it's a shift in philosophy, I think, from being punitive to taking those little steps and gaining those skills. So, thank you for being part of what we have going on. We couldn't do it without you. Like, we wouldn't have that option. So.
That's really the message that we've been giving the whole night, is like, how can we really look at this in a loving and embracing way rather than a, let's make you wrong about how you're showing up. I just really can't say enough about how much that never worked for me. Or any of the kids that I worked with.
Me neither.
It's difficult to see that, you know, right? As administrators, you feel like you have to come in and you have to do something, right?
yeah, I think collectively too, like there's no shortage of history to suggest that like it doesn't work. It'd be cool if it did. It'd be great if you could be like, hey, this thing that I did was real bad. It's super scary. Don't do it or you're grounded. Like I just got grounded all the time is all that meant. I was like, okay.
Right.
You know, and it just doesn't work. And I think that like there's a level of resistance to that like if we have Narcan at schools or like if you can get busted with pot and not get kicked off the football team, that's somehow admitting defeat. And I think that I think that's misguided, and I think in some ways it's like we have a problem, you know, like we just do. What we've been doing isn't working, and that's okay, but like I think to double down on it and to be like, ooh, we'll just get scarier and penalize more, it's like it just doesn't, you know, it didn't work for me, it didn't, you know, it just doesn't. There are different ways to do that, and I think it's really important to hold people accountable, to be like, hey, you did this thing, and it put other people in jeopardy because now this thing's available to them, and like there's absolutely a price to pay for that. You know, like you need to be responsible for your actions. There's a difference between holding people accountable and like trying to penalize them out of their actions, you know.
Mm-hmm. So. In terms of partnering with the hospital, because of course my ears went, A, talk to Mary Ann. B, you know, I did used to go and talk to the course at Ukiah High School, the Scrubs class. I would go, you know, talk to the Scrubs class, you know, if ever that's helpful, I can always do that. And there is a pediatric nurse practitioner out of, what's her name? The pediatric nurse practitioner out of Ukiah? Erica. Yeah, and she does a lot of community outreach for pediatrics specifically, and I'm sure she'd be super excited to do whatever you want her to do. she has like I think a day a week that she gets paid to do community outreach.
I want to thank you all also for your wisdom and what you've been through and what you've done. I want to make a statement. I also was raised in an alcoholic family, and I've worked in substance abuse. I'm a retired social worker now. I would just like to briefly address, it's not so much the preventative part, but the treatment part. In my opinion, this is a family disease.
Sure.
It just doesn't affect the person who has the addiction. It affects the entire family. And if you don't treat the entire family and you only treat the person with the addiction, that doesn't, in my opinion, that's only doing half the job.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is, in my own family, my father was a raving alcoholic, and he was very cruel. My mother and father had 4 sons. I was the youngest. 2 of those 4 sons had addictions to alcohol. The other 2, myself and one of my brothers, we had a different problem, and it was called codependency.
Sure.
And those things have to be treated. And if they're not treated, then you just continue to develop more problems, more families. The other part that I'm aware of and have worked a lot, I worked in a prison in Missouri, and most of the men that were in this drug rehab prison, they didn't have a father. And that's the epidemic that I'm aware of, is a lack of fathers in the home. The divorce rate, the children that don't live with fathers anymore, or never had a father, or the father was addicted or was in prison, is just astronomical about how it's a risk factor to contribute to the next generation of, I'm just speaking for men, that get into felony crimes because of addiction. So the last part I want to say is the 12-step program is so important for several reasons. One, the first step, we must admit we're powerless over whatever the addiction is. The second step is came to believe in a power greater than ourselves. And the third step is turn my will in my life. In my opinion, when we look at something outside of ourselves that's a power greater than ourselves, whatever the God of your understanding, that helps to deal with the addiction and in the family system, because you're not looking to self anymore, you're not looking to somebody else, you're not looking for love in all the wrong places, you're looking to a power greater than yourself that can restore you to sanity. And there is the serenity prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And in my opinion, that's where, when we're dealing with what's going on in the world, we may not like it, but we need to accept it so we keep our serenity. So thank you for listening.
Right on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. People started dying in massive numbers.
Yeah.
I mean, so many people were dying. I heard in Pittsburgh, they took up the entire, where do you take dead people? Morgue. The morgue was full, and they had to start taking out containers to put the dead bodies in.
So we're losing about 134 people a day in the United States.
Yeah. So when it got to that level, then the doctor started paying attention, sorry. But I think that's what happened. There was a lot of PR from the pharmaceutical companies that kind of got us headed down in the wrong direction. People are waking up and smelling the coffee. For the people that aren't waking up and smelling the coffee, there's increased government oversight. It's harder to prescribe. There's multiple different people that are watching what you're doing as a doctor. And there's a lot of education for us out there from our peers about how to try to do a better job of it.
I think something that Buffy brought up too, that is that pain tolerance, that we have 0. And I just want to say from that perspective of, let's say, you know, I had some surgery. A tumor was moved from my sinuses. And after that, they wanted to give me some pain medication. And I said no. And I remember it really bothering the nurse, and I could go get the doctor to be in my place. And we have to take that role on too. It isn't just, you know, the pharmaceutical company or anything else.
That's right, take some responsibility. And that reminds me of a patient I had who had been a heroin addict, and he had the worst knee arthritis. I mean, you think you guys have seen bad knee arthritis. I mean, he was like bow-legged when he walked. And when he had his second knee replaced, the second day after surgery, he told the nurse he refused any opiates. And this was like 15 years ago or something. He refused any opiates whatsoever, and he said, I'm going to take Celebrex. And she flipped. She like lost her wig. She thought that there was something wrong with him. And he was like, I mean, you can't force me.
Right, yeah. A few years ago, I had a very bad pinched nerve in my back, and I went to the hospital, the ER. I left with a prescription for 500 milligram ibuprofen, a prescription for a muscle relaxant, and a prescription for an opioid. And I knew not to fill the opioid. I come from a family with a lot of addiction problems, so I knew not to fill the opioid, so I didn't fill it. And so I filled the other two, and I didn't. And then I looked up the muscle relaxant and realized that that was addictive too. So I thought, well, I'll start with the ibuprofen, and if that doesn't work, then I'll take the muscle relaxant. So I started with the ibuprofen, and it worked fine.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So,
And doctors forget that, yeah.
yeah.
But also, they don't want you coming back. You know, they want to cover their bases. But yeah, no, we forget to do the basics. Or, you know, like sometimes you can give somebody a shot of lidocaine, like that works great. Or, you know, just really fundamental stuff that we forget about because the opiates were so easy.
Well, and they work.
And they work really well.
Yeah.
Well, in trauma, for sure. I mean, 2 years ago, I slipped and broke my leg. And when the ambulance finally got there and got me in their ambulance, I got fentanyl. And I was glad. And I think everyone else was pretty happy I had fentanyl, too.
Yeah.
So, I don't want to scare everyone, but, opioids, they don't have to go away. They still work very well in trauma situations and
Cancer.
Yeah, and we do have people who are on pain management and who will probably finish their years on that type of pain management, and we, don't want to add a stigma to them as well, because I deal with the community. I don't just deal with youth, and so when I talk to people who are on opiates, been on opiates for years, don't have a problem, I don't want to make them feel like they're less than. Yeah. So that's really key as well. So we have to find balance in all of this. Sorry, it's true.
My last comment, we had a community forum on how to improve our substance abuse services in this county, and most of the people, the professionals who are here right now are involved in that in some kind of way. There is invitation for community members to be involved in that. Marianne, myself, Buffy, I know we're all there, and we'll be happy to speak with people about that. And the one thing that stood out to me the most about the 2 days that I spent there was the doctor saying that they had developed this exercise that where pain is your physical reaction to something happening out of alignment, and suffering is your emotional response to the pain.
Yeah.
And that you can actually, they were working with Vietnam vets and vets in general about actually, I call it suffering management. And so I think it's a beautiful thing. I want to reiterate what you said, which is it's okay to feel pain. It's actually very important for us to feel pain, and that we can choose to have, we can have a different kind of suffering if we do the work about that. And that's one of the most interesting things that I've, from the kids who I've talked to that are extremely depressed and extremely anxious, who are taking antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication. I'd say most of the kids come back to me and they're like, Aurelie, I don't feel anything. Yeah. And I would rather feel down and out and depressed and hopeless and like completely like not at all than feel nothing. Because that's what the thing is, that anti-anxiety medication and antidepressant doesn't selectively numb. It numbs it all, right? And so so welcome. Like we all have to gonna like own, and be adults and be okay with a little bit of pain in our life. So.
Oh no!
Thank you all for your guys' attention. I know. I'm leaving. Thank you guys so much for all your guys' attention.
Thank you.